Hello everyone, this is Ishita Agarwal. Welcome you all in today's session on Achieve, Release and Deployment Process Excellence with BMC Remedy ITSM. So, before starting with the session, just take a brief look on the agenda which we would be covering on our today's session. Today, we would be discussing about the release management. We would be taking a look at the release request lifecycle, the various form views which are there in the release management process, the various roles involved in the release management, the approvals involved in release request, and obviously the release management task. Now let's begin with the introduction of release management. So what is a release management? Release management is the process responsible for planning, scheduling and controlling the movement of releases to test and live environment. This is totally built on the ITIL specifications. So according to ITIL, the primary objective of release management is to ensure that the integrity of the live environment is protected and the correct components are released. Before moving further with the release management discussion, we should all be knowing the meaning of term release. So what is a release? Actually, the release stands for a collection of related authorized changes to an IT service that are tested and introduced into the live environment together. And when we are talking about the release, we should actually be knowing what all type of releases are there in a release request process and when we'll be using that actually. So, we could have full, delta, package and backlog release types in a release request. Talking about the first release type, that is the full, we would be using this release type when all the components of the releases are built, tested and deployed together. So if we want to make sure that the release or version of an application plus the necessary CI components to run the application are all linked throughout the entire process. Now coming next to the next release type, that is Delta 1, which includes only incremental changes and only those components or CIs that need to be included in the release. When we'll be using this? Obviously, we would go for that when our application was moving from version 1.0.00 to 1.1.00. The next release type, that is the package, which includes all individual full and delta releases together and form a packaged release. We use package release type if we combine several minor and major updates together. Now, coming to the last release type, that is backlog, which is actually providing us a method to identify and review multiple changes, incidents and problems that are candidates to target to implement in a release. This release type is a grouping mechanism that our change advisory board uses as their candidates to review for future releases. As a part of BMC's business service management strategy, the release management module is included with BMC Remedy Change Management, which is built in ITIL V3 best practices to track and manage change and deployment activities. So now, we can conclude this that the goal of release management is to provide enhanced out-of-box support for managing standard release activities from request to planning and design, building, testing, deployment and obviously the acceptance. Now, we could all come to a common point that when we have change management process running in our service provider environment, why actually we need to have release management? So the answer could be With numerous changes occurring daily, release management is the key component in making sure that applications are successfully deployed without compromising the integrity or availability of the production environment. And obviously, if I am using the word changes here, that refers to the ones that are already authorized by the change management process. Now, using a systematic and repeatable release process, organizations can achieve greater success rates of change rollout, higher quality of IT service, and accelerated time to market. Now, after understanding these concepts, release request processes concept, we could now come to the point that what are the various roles that are involved in a release request process. So, as every deployable application has roles behind it, we have the roles as release coordinator, change manager, task implementer, and activity assignee. So coming back to our first role that is involved in a release request process, what does a release coordinator performs in a release request? So the release coordinator would be the one who would be reviewing the request for change for the services for which he is acting as a release coordinator after they have been passed on from the change management. He is actually splitting the requirements of releases into logical groups that can be handled efficiently by change managers. He also prepares a business case for a new release when additional funding is needed for its implementation. He initiates the implementation of releases and decides on corrective actions as needed. And finally, he organizes and conducts post-implementation meetings to collect improvement suggestions for future releases. So this is the work which release coordinator performs during a release request. Now, as we know, this release process is closely linked with the change management processes. So we have the next role as a change manager. As we have earlier discussing the point that a release is actually a combination of related authorized changes. So for that associated change request, we have the role of change manager. He would be the one who would be reviewing the risk and impact analysis to make sure that this has been performed thoroughly. He also ensures that the appropriate actions have been planned to minimize both the risk of failure and the impact on the users during change implementation. He ensures that the timing of planned implementation does not conflict with other planned changes or events. And finally, he would be obtaining approval for the changes. Then, as we have discussed, the release can have multiple change requests, and for that we have the role of change manager. Likewise, a change request could have multiple tasks associated with it. So for that, we have the role of task implementer. So task implementer would be obviously a support staff member who would be performing the task associated with a change request. You can take up an example as if I have a task of installation of new server. So I would be assigning this installation of new server task to a task implementer, and his responsibility would be to install the new server. So he uses the change management console to perform the installation task which is associated with the change request. Now coming to our last role, which is activity assigning. As if we have the concept of having change request in a release request, likewise we could have a number of activities which are associated with a release request. So the staff members or the groups who perform these activities which are associated with the release request are known as activity assignees. For example, a release request is something about the installation of a new software application. So it could relate some activities as if like it could have the activities as if creation of new training materials, train the employees on the software application, and so on. So for that purposes, we'll be giving this task to the activity assignees. You can view these different roles in this figure where you are actually viewing this release coordinator, release approver, change coordinator, task implementer, and activity assignee, and the subsequent roles and responsibilities performed by them. Now we are done with the introduction of release management processes. What all roles are there in a release management process. Now coming to the point, what all milestones we'll be encountering while moving in a release request. So now, the following sections walks you through the milestones of a release request lifecycle. As in the figure itself, you can see the process flow status bar, which is telling you the different milestones which you will be encountering while raising up a release request up to the closure of a release request. So these are actually the milestones. So what is a milestone actually? In the release management module, a milestone is a significant event in the release project which includes a major deliverable, or you can also term it as a grouping mechanism to identify key points in the release process. For an example, when I'll be saying I have completed the initiate milestone, that means I have successfully created a release request that has been approved by CAB, my Change Advisory Board. So this is the release request lifecycle where we can see the different milestones: initiate, plan, build, test, deployment, and close down, and the various approvals which we can configure in between these milestones. So as we have already seen the different milestones, these are initiate, plan, build, test, deployment, and close down. We would be dealing with these milestones when we would be raising up a release request. To have a better understanding of these milestones, let's see a user case to have a look of what all is done at different milestones in a release request along with their descriptions. So talking about the very first milestone, that is the initiate milestone. So let's suppose Henry is having a people profile who is having the release coordinator functional role, and he is going to create a release request in a release request form. So from the figure itself, you can view that the Henry is having the functional role of release coordinator, obviously with the support group affiliations with it. In this figure, you can see this is a new release request console from where we could raise up a new request. In this, the release request initially appears in a draft status. As you can see in the figure itself, that our release request is in the draft status, and the release ID is automatically filled with the ID number of the release request when you start entering the information into the request. Now the release coordinator name is Henry, who is a release coordinator for this release request. Then I could have a release template which is used to fill out the contents of the release request. In the summary field, I can enter a brief description of the release. As in this case, we have entered that the payroll service is to be installed on the payroll server. Again, in the notes field, I could provide a more complete description of the release. You can always relate a service to the release request. At the initiate milestone, the release manager prepares a business case to justify the release. In this, release manager specifies the business justification of the release to initiate the implementation of the release and to decide on corrective actions if needed. So you can view in the figure itself that there is a business justification field from which we have taken up the option as of upgrade. Then you need to mention the target date. Again, we would be specifying the impacts, urgencies, whose sum and ends up to the summation of the priority. You can also view the field of risk level, which is there to indicate the relative risk associated with the release. Its value actually falls from the number 5, which is the highest risk, to the number 1, which is the lowest risk. And the default value is risk level 1. This field is used as a criteria to determine required approvals. So in our business case, we have chosen the default risk level number. Beside that field, you can view this roll up button, which is there to accumulate the risk levels from the related change request displayed on the manifest tab. So we could have a number of change requests in the manifest tab, and depending upon the risk level associated with each change request, I could roll up and accumulate a common risk level associated with this release request. This risk level is not performed automatically, but you can always go on and override the risk roll up with a different value. Moving ahead with the other fields, in the date time tab, you can see the schedule start date and schedule end date. So the Henry, who is the release coordinator in our user case, he then blocks out a time segment to work on the release by indicating the schedule start and end dates. Now, the very important part of the initiate milestone. When you will be in the initiate milestone, you should create a release manifest. What is a manifest then? A manifest functions like a packing list or an invoice. It describes the schedule and provides an overview of the contents of a particular release. In the manifest tab itself, you can split the requirements of the release into logical group of change requests and activities that can be handled efficiently by the change coordinators and activity assignees. We all are familiar with the change request, but there is also involvement of activities in a manifest. So, again, the specific unit of work are called activities. Activities again have their own life cycle with a series of status transitions, for example, draft, assigned, and so on. You can always establish a sequence of tasks in your activities. It will be useful when we need to create a structured sequence of tasks that we must complete to fulfill the release. But mind you, we can never take these tasks as the change request. They'll only be considered as the tasks associated with the activities only. So coming back to our user case, Henry can create and schedule these in a release manifest. By doing so, actually he is getting a consolidated view of the task that the release management team must perform to drive the completion of the change request and activities required to close the release. So in our user case, he performs the following action. Firstly, he would be creating a change request to install the new server for the payroll service at the deployment milestone in a change form. And you can see in the figure itself that this is a new change form where change ID is generated. Now we have given the summary as the installation of new server for the payroll service. Again, we have specified some descriptive information about this change request. We have chosen the class, change reason, impacts, urgencies, and its priority, the target date when we want these changes to get implemented, and we have chosen the change manager as the Mary L, who will be acting as the change manager for this particular change request. You can see the Mary's profile on the people form, who is having a functional role of infrastructure change manager. Now, as we were associating this change request at the deployment milestone, so while saving up this change request, it would ask us in which milestone I want this change request to get embedded. So I choose on the deployed and click on close. Then, after creating a successful change request with respect to a release request, Henry also wants to create an activity to train the employees on the new payroll service. That means after installation of new payroll service to the server, employees needs to be trained on them. For that, he would be creating an activity and he's assigning the task of that activity to the John, who is actually the activity assignee. We can view up this new activity form where we have mentioned the summary as training the employees on the new payroll service and correspondingly a perfect notes for that. He's been assigned to the John. After embedding this change request and activities to the release request, a collision detection is automatically running when he saves the release. This tool actually determines if there are other change requests which are scheduled to work on the same CI during the same scheduled time and helps the Henry to manage and resolve these potentially harmful conflicting change requests. As you can view in this figure, that collision detection forms has been opened up, and while clicking on any of the checkboxes that is detected, which I have chosen, you can identify the collisions of the current change request which you have embedded in your release request to other change requests with the same timings. So here you can view that the result says no collision found.
Questions will get, we'll take it at the end of the session.
Before moving further, I just want to make one point clear. If you people are having any queries, we would love to entertain them at the end of the session. So you can write it down in your chat window and I would try to sort them out. So coming back to our session, now we are moving further with the next milestone, that is the plan milestone. In the planning milestone, the release manager must plan the details associated with the release. In this case, Henry would be reviewing the release plan. Henry reviews this request for the change with Mary, who was the change manager of the service for which the release is to be implemented, that we have seen earlier. And together, they would be dividing the requirements of the different requests for changes amongst them, and they draft a high-level implementation plan that indicates the duration of each change and the dependencies between these changes. In this milestone itself, for the activity which Henry has initially created to train the employees for the new payroll service, he has added up the task to that activity. So, John, the activity assignee, plans to add training tasks to the activity that will be implemented in the last deployment phase. So, here What we were doing in our user case, we would be choosing up an ad hoc task and would be relating that ad hoc task to the activity which we have initially created in the initiate milestone. This is a new task window where we are creating an ad hoc task, and the summary is trainers must provide training and user documentation to all staff. So this task is associated with the activity and the activities associated with the release request in our manifest. So now you can view that this task is attached with an activity of the release request and is having the status of staged. Coming next to our build milestone, as you can see in the figure that now our process status bar flows into the milestone of build. So here Henry, which were our release coordinator in the user case, is establishing the approach to build the controlled environment before the release goes into production. For an example, after a change has been approved, he oversees the final build delivery of the new service. The build milestone assembles the CIs that are needed to create the release package before it goes into the service. For instance, in our user case, he'll check whether the correct software is available to install into the new payroll server. Now, moving to the next milestone, that is our test milestone. In the test milestone, the release coordinator, who was Henry, makes sure that the CI's IT service or process meet their specifications and requirements. When all the tests have been completed satisfactorily, the release coordinator seeks approval from the BMC Remedy Change Management for the actual deployment. So this is actually considered as a manual stage. You can see in the figure that now our process flow status bar comes to the milestone of testing. Now moving to the deployment milestone. In this milestone, release is rolled out to the business. In this use case, the change request and the release activity that make up the release are marked closed during the deployment milestone. So now the change request for the installation of new payroll service and the activity of training employees on the new application software should be completed. So again, we'll get back to the change management console and we'll make up our change request to move to the implement stage. In this implement stage, the change coordinator would actually be implementing all the tasks which are there associated with this change request. The Mary, who was the change manager in our user case, opens up the change request and moves it to the implement stage. In this stage, he again creates a task for the installation of the new payroll service to the payroll server. Here you can see this is a task window which is actually created with respect to the change request. Now this task is associated with the change request, which is finally in the background is linked with the release request in the manifest tab. So the one who was assigned to implement this task, that is Charles D in our user case, would be the task implementer, and he would be installing the new server, making the task status as closed. As you can see in this change window, now in the implementation stage, this task is actually having the status of closed. Now, the Mary, who is the change manager, can go on and close this change request. Now after closing the change request, the next task is to close the activity. So the activity assignee John executes the training activity. When all of them finish their task, she marks the activity as completed. So now you can view in this figure that both the change request and the activities which are associated with the release request in the manifest tab, which is right now currently working in the deployment milestone, is now set with the status of closed. So when all the change requests and activities reach closed status, use the process status flow area to move the release request from the deployment in progress status to close down approval phase. उनके साइड से भी आवाजें आती हैं क्या?
ऐसे नहीं करना चाहिए।
मैं आउट करती हूँ।
म्यूट कर दूँ। हाँ तो हाँ
अनम्यूट कर
नहीं सब आ रहे
मैं इनसे पूछूंगा कि are you able to view my
आवाज आ रही है उसमें आवाज आ रही है उधर से
कब आई बिना क्या आवाज आ रही थी
उनकी तरफ से
ठीक है बिना से कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं कैन अनम्यूट एंड यू कैन स्टार्ट म्यूट करके स्टार्ट कितनी देर से आ रही है
अब भी जस्ट
वो डेंजरस आवाज नहीं आई ना
नहीं सुनाई दे रहा था नहीं
Sorry for the interruption. Now moving with the last milestone, that is closed. Now the release request enters the close down milestone. After the release request is at close down approval phase, you cannot close the release request until all the tasks are closed due to success, cancellation, or maybe failure. When all the tasks related to the release request are closed, the requester and the release manager are notified that the release is resolved. At this milestone itself, the reviewers provide feedback on the effectiveness of the release and record metrics for the deployment to make sure that the release met its survey targets. Henry, the release coordinator, in its milestone, verifies there is minimal unproductive impact to the IT infrastructure and makes sure the users are satisfied with the user documentation and training. So up till this point, we have seen different milestones in a release request and understood the roles and responsibilities performed at each milestone. So now we'll be moving ahead with the different default global approval processes for the release management. So in this release management, we have 6 different approval phases defined as per the 6 milestones. The very first is initiate phase, which starts when the release request is placed in initiation approval state. This is defined in the process release level CI initiate. The next approval phase is our planning. This phase is defined in process release level CI planning, which is used with the configuration item on the approval mapping form. The planning phase starts when the release request is placed in planning approval status. So, if that request gets approved, it moves to the in progress status. If that request is rejected, it moves to the rejected status. And if we have not mapped any approvers in the approval mapping form, the release request moves to the in progress status and requires the release coordinator to move the request forward. The next approval phase, that is the build one, according to the third milestone in a release request. This phase is defined in process release level CI build, which is used with configuration items on the approval mapping form. Again, this phase starts when the release request is placed in build approval status, and according to the approvals, rejections, or if no approvals are mapped, the consecutive activities are performed. Moving to the next approval phase, that is test, which is defined in the process release level CI test, which is used with configuration item on the approval mapping form, and it starts when the release request is placed in test approval status. Deployment approval phase, which is defined in process release level CI deployment. Again, it is used with the configuration item on the approval mapping form, and it starts when the release request is placed in deployment approval status. If approved, moves further. If rejected, get back to the rejected status. If no approvers, only the release coordinator would be required to move the request forward. And the last approval phase, that is the close down. It is also defined in the phase of release level CI close down, used with the configuration item with the approval mapping form. This phase starts when the release request is placed in the close down approval status. So in this case, if that release request is approved, it moves to the completed status. And if no approvers are mapped to the close down phase, the release request moves to the completed status. By default, all these global approval phases are enabled. Then, if we are using the process type of label, we need to map the approvers to approver phases for this approval processes to determine who would be responsible to approve that specific approval phases. So, here you can see in this window that this is the approval mapping form in which I have decided the Henry to be the one who would be approving the changes for the phase of initiate. So from this, we are coming to the end of the session, and thank you to all of you for devoting your precious time and being the patient listeners. We can summarize what we have studied in this session. We have gone through the release management lifecycle. We have seen different approvers, different roles that are there in the release management, obviously covering the concept of the release management. We have seen different milestones, what all roles and responsibilities these roles do in these milestones, and at what level these milestones are moving further with their next milestones. So, if you have any queries, I would love to answer them. You can type in your queries in your chat window and I'll try to sort them out.